everybody. Welcome back to On the Block Radio. This is your host, Andy Gurvich. We are glad you were with us for this, what is really quite a long episode. But where do you got to be? What, are you going to watch more reruns of Game of Thrones? What, are you into the baseball playoffs? There's nowhere you need to be but here with us. And I think when we get into this episode, you're going to see why it's so long. When I started the show, as you know, as I talk about regularly, I wanted to interact with people that I think were really doing amazing things around the concept of transformation and an expansion of our understanding and expression of our own consciousness, both individually and collectively. The other thing I really wanted to do with the show was become kind of an archivist. There were people that I've been fortunate enough to come across in my work, in my studies, that I think you need to be aware of if you're not already aware of them. People that I think are real treasures regarding the human experience. People whose work butts up against the very edges of what it means to understand ourselves. And Stephan Schwartz is one of those people. I am a board member for a group called the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness, which is a group of anthropologists and academics from around the country and around the world who exist as a subset of the American Association of Anthropology, which is the oldest academic institution in the country. And, the SAC was founded by Stephan Schwartz and others, as you'll hear in the interview, as a response or taking up, really, the challenge that Carlos Castaneda, for those of you that have read his books, posed to the study of anthropology, to the study of the human experience. And that challenge was this: can you fully understand some things like indigenous reality, things like shamanism, things like an indigenous perspective on the world, purely from studying it, purely from viewing it from the outside in a kind of quasi-scientific objective stance? And what Castaneda said was, no, there are certain things that you cannot understand in the world unless you fully experience them. For many of us, we kind of go, yeah, no shit. But this was a huge, huge problem for anthropology, which was trying to establish itself as a kind of hard science. So Stephan was one of the founders of an organization that really took that charge up and started researching the world with that in mind. You have to fully experience something in order to really understand it. Stephan is a forerunner and the nature of people that study the nature of consciousness. And this is really the big $60 billion question of the 21st century. What is consciousness? There are really two camps. We'll be returning to this over and over on the show, and there's gradations within those camps. One sees consciousness as what they call epiphenomena, something that emerges out of the material universe once it hits a level of complexity. That single-cell organisms evolve into more complex organisms and then evolve into primates eventually, and then at some point along the line, the level of complexity is reached where consciousness sort of switches on out of inanimate objects. The other camp, led by physicists like Max Planck and others, Amit Goswami, just to name a couple, says that consciousness is immaterial, that whatever consciousness is, it is not something that emerges from the physical universe, but that it's the other way around. The physical universe emerges from consciousness. This is a profound concept, one that is still quite controversial, and one that is not believed by everybody. Folks make all kinds of accusations that this is a way to sort of gussy up the God hypothesis, and other kinds of accusations. And so there's a real fault line in the study of consciousness. What is this consciousness that we possess? And it is something that emanates from the human animal alone? Do other organisms share it? Where does it come from? Can it exist outside of the body? These are profound questions that have been left to faith and philosophy for quite a long time, that are starting to, really through the area of physics and through cultural anthropology, starting to be taken up more seriously by academics. Stephan is also one of the earliest researchers in remote viewing. And we reference a story in the piece. Believe it or not, we had the guy on for 3 hours and we still didn't get to everything that we wanted to talk to him about. I talked with him about, in the piece, I ask him over and over again in the interview, you'll see about his experiments in Egypt, but we never got to that. So I just want to quickly mention this. Stephan was a part of a project that's chronicled in a book of his called the Alexandria Project, that I hope you check out. He told me in a conversation once that his work in remote viewing anytime that they would publish their findings and show that this was indeed possible, people would just not believe it. Like, that's not possible because it's not possible, regardless of how that they worked to show that their data was conclusive and had been gathered effectively and according to appropriate methodological parameters. And people would just dismiss it, saying, well, I don't care, that there's no way that this is possible. And so he said, the only way that we're going to be able to prove that this is happening is to find something that everyone knows is lost. And so in the book, The Alexandria Project, and I wanted to get to this in our conversation, but we didn't, he tells the story of how they were contacted by the Egyptian government and went over there and actually brought an individual that Stephen had used to do other remote viewing experiments, and they were able to locate several items, including the tomb of Marc Antony and several artifacts relating to Cleopatra. And the Egyptian government was blown away by this and honored Stephen by giving him some ancient artwork as a part of those dynasties. And this becomes another a piece of evidence. Another one you're going to hear is the Deep Quest experiments in this conversation about the reality and possibility of remote viewing. Are people able to tap into a kind of collective consciousness and navigate it and understand it? Controversial stuff, folks. I don't know what I think of it. I don't know what you're going to think of it. I know that Stephen is a profoundly intelligent man. He's a numbers guy. He's not guided by belief or by some connection to the new age. He's a scientist. He's a researcher, and he goes where the data takes him. And the data, according to him, has taken him really to the edge of possibility in terms of how we understand the material universe and our place in it. He's driven by a need to be compassionate and life-affirming, and something I've tried to take up myself. And I just find him to be a completely engaging individual and somebody I think you're going to really enjoy hearing from. We're going to hope to have him on again in the coming months, and maybe even open the phones up so folks can call in and ask him some of these questions about some of the things he's talking about. Lastly, I want to tell you that we're inches away from being on iTunes, and then having that available to you folks as well as another place to download and listen to the show. Hope maybe even by next week. So thank you for bearing with us. As always, look us up, www.ontheblockradio.com. Interact with us. Let us know what you think about the show. Suggestions for future guests, music, authors, artists, and all of the above are always welcome. All right, welcome to the program, folks. We're glad you're with us.
Welcome to On the Block with Andrew Gurevich, a podcast about authentic people doing beautiful things. Enjoy the show.
All right, welcome back to the program, folks. You are listening to On the Block Radio. This is your host, Andy Gurevich, and I am very excited for this week's episode. As I am always telling you, this is a show about transformation and creativity, about finding authentic people who are creating beauty in the world through their work and, by example, through the lives they lead. You also always hear me saying that the guest we have for this current week embodies this notion better than anybody that I know, but I really do mean that this week, actually. If you know names like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Ray Kurzweil, Stephen Hawking, Carl Sagan, or Elon Musk, Stanley Krippner, Timothy Leary, Carlos Castaneda, Edgar Cayce, or Art Bell, then you also need to know the name Stephan Schwartz. Stephen A. Schwartz is a distinguished consulting faculty of Saybrook University in San Francisco, California, and a research associate of the Cognitive Sciences Laboratory of the Laboratories for Fundamental Research. He is a columnist for the journal Explore and the editor of the daily web publication SchwartzReport.net, where he covers issues relating to the future of medicine, technology, the environment, and other related topics. His academic and research appointments include Senior Samueli Fellow for Brain, Mind, and Healing of the Samueli Institute, founder and research director of the Mobius Laboratory, Director of Research for the Rhine Research Center and Senior Fellow of the Philosophical Research Society. His government appointments include Special Assistant for Research and Analysis to the Chief of Naval Operations and Consultant to the Oceanographer of the Navy. He has also been an editorial staff member of National Geographic, Associate Editor of Sea Power, and staff reporter and feature writer for the Daily Press and the Times Herald. For 40 years, he has been studying the nature of consciousness, particularly that aspect independent of space and time. Schwartz is part of the small group that formed modern remote viewing research and is the principal researcher studying the use of remote viewing in archaeology. Using remote viewing, he discovered Cleopatra's Palace, Marc Antony's Timonium, ruins of the Lighthouse of Pharos, and sunken ships along the California coast and in the Bahamas. He also uses remote viewing to examine the future. Since 1978, he has been getting people to remote view the year 2050, and out of that has come a complex trend analysis. His submarine experiment, Deep Quest, used remote viewing to help determine that non-local consciousness is not an electromagnetic phenomena. Other areas of experimental study that Stephan has done include research into creativity, meditation, and therapeutic intent and healing. He is the author of more than 130 technical reports and published papers. In addition to his experimental studies, he has written numerous magazine articles for Smithsonian, OMNI, American History, American Heritage, The Washington Post, The New York Times, as well as other magazines and newspapers. He has produced and written a number of television documentaries and has written several books, including The Secret Vaults of Time, The Alexandria Project, Mind Rover, Opening to the Infinite, and his latest book, The 8 Laws of Change. Stephan, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be here, Andy.
Unfortunately, we're out of time after I just read that bio.
Yeah.
So thank you for being here.
With holding a lily, I guess.
I call you the Miles Davis of paranormal research. I don't know if you know the story where he was at the White House once, and I think it was Jimmy Carter's wife, or it might have been Nixon's wife, who asked him who he was and what he did. And he said, I've reinvented music 4 times in my life. And I really feel like that you're a person who's kind of reinvented academic research and moved the goalpost in terms of our understanding of the paranormal and where it fits into a calculable understanding of the world. So again, welcome to the show, and I can't wait to jump into some of this with you.
Hey, well, go for it.
So let's start at the beginning, because I think you have a great story. Do you mind if we back up before we get into some of the research and just talk about some of the early?
No, not at all.
So you grew up in Old World, Virginia, right? Your family goes back to, 1609 in Virginia?
Yes, that's right.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I'm an odd mix of my mother's family came in the early 1600s, and my father's family came in 1906.
Wow!
In one of the great migrations. So I'm an interesting mix of both relatively a recent immigrant wave and then a very, very old immigrant wave, and I've got several members of my family that have played prominent roles in American history, and so it's between the two combinations, it's given me the opportunity to look at the country and the trends that have shaped it from several perspectives.
Yeah, that's really interesting. When you talk about having these two components in your life, two perspectives, really, two levels of consciousness, one that's sort of a legacy family and the other that embodies the immigrant experience. So how do you think those have shaped you more specifically in those views?
Well, I think my mother's family gave me a very early interest, which I have proceeded with. Really, it's one of the threads of my life, and that is the issues surrounding the foundation of America and the history of the early American Republic. So I'm a Franklin scholar and a George Mason scholar, and I've been very interested in what the founders really were trying to attempt and why they were doing what they were doing, and I've written about it fairly widely. And And I also have an interest in the more modern immigrant experiences and what they have done for the country, and to try to get the sense. Well, I mean, one of the things it's left me with is that everybody, without exception, in North America, in what is now the United States, is an immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody came from somewhere else. There was nobody here originally, so everyone, including what we call Native Americans, or in Canada, First Nation people, I mean, they came from somewhere else too. So everyone is an immigrant.
Right.
And,
some people did it 18,000 years ago. Some people did it 80 years ago. But
yes, but largely for the same reasons. They were looking for a better opportunity, a place to make a better life. Whether it was better hunting or better research, it's the fundamental human impulses were pretty much the same. And once you think of things that way, then you realize that whether you're a modern immigrant or an ancient immigrant, you're still an immigrant, and you came here from somewhere else for reasons that were aspirational in nature, and it has shaped our national character. And until well into the 1950s, the United States was really a frontier consciousness culture. I mean, with Alaska joining and Hawaii becoming the last two states, really up until that point, there was always frontier in a sort of psychological sense, and it shaped so much of American history. If you go back and look at it just as a story of human beings, it's the story of people who are immigrants and who strike out for better opportunity.
You know, it's really interesting. I read somewhere that Terence McKenna once said when he was at the Esalen Institute that he was looking out over the Pacific Ocean, and he was really reminded of this idea that when we hit the Western Pacific, we kind of hit the edge of manifest destiny, and this notion of infinite progress outward stopped, and then this is where the beginning in the American tradition, at least, of kind of introspective psychology and, the whole sort of hippie uprising began, because then the quest became the look inward, because we couldn't push outward.
Terence, I think, was onto something there, because you can look at American history and see that there was a change in gestalt from the time that the sort of the frontier mentality ended, and then we began trying to understand that, I think, and to integrate it into the culture. We began this experience that started in the 60s of a kind of introspection and awakening of an inner self that was a new kind of frontier to explore.
I want to go back a little bit to your family. I'm just really interested in the experience of growing up in one of these legacy families. Was there a set of expectations put on you for the kind of work you could go into, for the kind of person you should be in the world? I'm just interested in what the I don't want to say positives and negatives, but the complexities of coming from something that's so rooted in American culture. It was, you know what I mean? How did you manage that as a young person?
Well, it's very interesting. I actually didn't really understand this until I was in my 50s. But because it was never actually said, there were several things that I think that came out of this experience. One is a deep commitment that church and state must be separated. And I think that arose not only from my father's family, because partly they were, I think, responding to religious persecution, but also on my mother's side. The founders, either through direct experience or immediate family experience, all had a profound comprehension of of what happens when the church and the state are one.
Mm-hmm.
They had been subject to personal persecution or familial persecution that was part of the immediate family story. And so they went to great lengths to separate church and state. The kind of revisionist history we now hear a lot of, particularly coming from the right, is just a fantasy land, because if you go back and not only look at what these people said, but also what their personal narrative was.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people came to the United States from, for instance, the United Kingdom, largely to escape persecution and even prosecution,
right,
by state religion or religious authorities. I mean, that's why the Quakers came to the United States. That's why Roger Smith came to the United States. And we have states like Rhode Island that were founded basically on that fundamental principle. The Pilgrims came because they had been persecuted,
mm-hmm.
and they were trying to create a new order. So from the very foundation of the country, the idea that the church and the state should not be one is a significant and powerful trend.
Mm-hmm.
And that was certainly true in my family. And also, although we never really discussed it, there was always it's interesting. I'm struggling to how to explain this, because it wasn't really so much that it was openly discussed. It's just the way people behaved. But there was a strong orientation that you ought to be involved in something that makes things better.
Mm-hmm.
And, when my father died, I went down to help settle his estate with the man who had handled his accounts. He was an anesthesiologist and a professor of medicine, and we were going through, the sort of things you go through when you do an estate, and there was this one green. This was back before the computers, and there was this one green accounting book, and we went through everything except this one, and I finally said to the man, what's that green accounting book about? And he paused for a long moment, and you could see he was struggling with something, and then he said, well, your father's gone, I guess I can say this now. And I thought, oh my goodness, what am I going to hear? And he said, those are the people your father didn't charge. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, nobody knows this, but about 20 to 25% of the work your father did, he didn't charge because people couldn't afford it.
Wow.
And so he just didn't charge for it. But the IRS required him to keep track of it. So he had to account for it. So that's what's in this book. Nobody knew that. I didn't know it. My mother didn't know it. His partners didn't. Nobody knew it. I had one great aunt who founded the Frontier Nursing Corps, which still exists and which trains young nurses and provides health care to low-income families in Appalachia. I've been doing it for 100 years now, and since Mary Breckenridge began.
Yeah.
And my other great aunt, Winifred Culbertson, started the Children's Convalescent Movement. And my mother was a nurse midwife. So,
wow.
So my daughters, one of my daughters is the executive vice president of a social services foundation. Another, my niece runs a NGO in England. My sister started a school system in London for underprivileged children on welfare, most of them children of color, immigrant families.
See, I didn't know this about you, and it's sort of annoying that other members of your family are also doing this kind of relevant work in the world.
It's a whole family thing, but it's never discussed.
Yeah, see, that's interesting. I wonder if, from what I know about you and your work, two things come to mind as maybe the genesis of this altruism, and one of them is that nature of altruism that comes from the European tradition of spiritual humanism that comes to us through people like Franklin and Thomas Paine. And the other, I think, might be, since you have family roots that go into this country so deep, an awareness of the fact of what was done to indigenous people here as a result of the founding of this nation, and maybe a sense of responsibility to try to do whatever is we can to ease that, monumental and generational suffering.
I agree with you, and I would add to that, Andrew, that a deep conflict about slavery and the unresolved issues of race in this country. I mean, my mother told the story when I was a little boy that she had two great uncles who had gotten up from the table when they heard that Fort Sumner had been attacked. They got up from the luncheon table, shook hands, and went out separate doors, one to serve in the Confederate Army and one in the Union Army.
Wow.
And each of them was killed at the Battle of Antietam.
No kidding.
So I think there was a sense of awareness that terrible wrongs had been done in the conquest by Europeans of North America and the displacement of indigenous people, and also the legacy of slavery, and a sense that you had a responsibility when you understood that to serve the good, to try to improve that situation in some way. And but again, as I say, I know in novels they always discuss that behind the scenes people talk about this. We never actually talked about it. It's just I think you saw what other people were doing, and so when you grew up, you started doing it too. I mean, that's the only thing I can explain, because I certainly never heard from my parents, you have to commit yourself to a portion of your time to the service of the good, and yet that's what they did, and so I guess I started doing it. And my daughter and my niece and my sister, they did it too. But as I say, nobody's ever asked me this before, but it just was never discussed. But it was taught by example. I guess that's the way to put it.
It's fascinating to me because it kind of harkens back to this old world ethic, and that even goes into a biblical motif of when you're fasting or praying or serving God, don't make a big spectacle out of it. Just do it sort of quietly and go about your business. I think it's a great juxtaposition to what we see a lot in the modern world of people doing the opposite, which is clicking like on a Facebook status about Black Lives Matter and then going back to their lives and doing absolutely nothing to make change in the world. And so now we have a lot of people that talk a lot about this kind of thing, but do very little. And so what you're talking about is exactly the opposite, about a culture that talks about it, that doesn't really talk about it, but just does it. And I really find that fascinating.
Well, it's my new book, The 8 Laws of Change. I mean, what really drove me to write that book, other than that my wife said, you will write this book. You've been talking about it. You need to write this book.
I'm tired of hearing about it.
Right, exactly. Ronlin had very strong feelings about it. But in any case, I think the takeaway from it for me was that individual acts made a difference. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that if you selected for the compassionate and life-affirming option, you were in service of the good, however you understood that. And I began, 4 times in my life, I've been involved in seeing history changed. The civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, when, I was started out as a teenager and was just offended. It seemed very unfair that people were discriminated against on the basis of their skin color, and then you got down to, well, how white, what exact skin tone made you white? I mean, it's kind of crazy when you get into it. that choices that people made about the things that they bought, for instance, could make a difference. And I really began to do research looking at how does this process work? I mean, how do people who don't have official position, power, or wealth, how do they create social change? And I guess secondarily, how successful are they at it? I mean, is it a kind of fool's errand, or can you actually make something happen?
Mm-hmm.
And in the 4 times that I have been involved, I realized that it really did get down to individuals. As I say, civil rights in the 50s and 60s. In the 70s, I was the special assistant to the chief of naval operations, and my function was to write the speeches and congressional testimony and op-ed pieces that explained to the world how we were trying to change the military from the elitist conscription organization of Vietnam to the all-volunteer meritocracy that we have today.
Wow.
And then in the 80s, the citizen diplomacy movement, in which we tried to establish back channels between the Soviet Union and the United States at the height of the Cold War, because we were concerned we were going to blow ourselves up, and we wanted to create these back channels, and they actually became quite important to both governments. And then the 4th one is the consciousness movement, and the shift that you already noted to beginning to consider the role of consciousness, because, you know, if you start from the premise that we're just animated meat and that consciousness is purely physiologically based, you sort of create one kind of culture. It has a dominionist point of view.
Sure.
You know, the earth is a dead, exploitable bank of resources. We're here to hold dominion over it. That's one worldview, but there's another and happily emerging worldview, and that is that we are one part of a matrix of life, that all life is interconnected and interdependent, that we live within the biosphere of Earth as part of this matrix, and yet that consciousness is fundamental, as Max Planck, the father of quantum mechanics, said. Consciousness is fundamental, and space-time is its manifestation. And so the idea that there is a continuity of consciousness, something which in earlier times, pre-scientific times, was taken as a given, but in modern times, when consciousness was just seen as sort of this strange ghost in the machine, that physicalist worldview has not produced the kind of outcomes that we might have hoped for.
Well, you've given us a bunch to chew on there. We're going to go to our first break and then come back and dive into each of those things you just brought up. I want to backtrack a little bit and talk to you about a little more about your time with the Navy, and then I want to have you talk, if you don't mind, recount a story you told me about your time in New York, which then led to your time with the Cayce family. And then I want to get into everything you just talked about, including the remote viewing projects, the Mobius Institute, the new book. You just said something that I found interesting that I want to leave us with before we go to break, in relationship to what you were saying about consciousness and the physicalist idea that it's sort of an emergent property from dead matter. Our friend of the show and Terence McKenna's brother, Dennis, in an interview that we had with Chris Ryan, once said that science, modern materialist science, had to pronounce nature dead so it could start performing the autopsy. And I thought that was a brilliant quote. Folks, you're listening to On the Block Radio. This is your host, Andy Gurvich. Our guest is Stephan Schwartz, and we will be back after these messages.
Thanks for listening to On the Block. Talk is cheap, ours is free.
Yeah, it's me, your heart. Listen to me. We've got to talk. High blood pressure is serious, and yours? Whoa. What happened to us? We used to be so much more active. But lately you've been ignoring me. I know you think I'm just gonna keep ticking away forever, but you're wrong. You can do so much more to control your high blood pressure. Doing the minimum isn't doing enough. I'm under a lot of pressure and can quit whenever I want. Bet you didn't know that. But I like my job. Just treat me better. Check on me. Give me something green to nibble on every once in a while. And maybe we can do some exercise on occasion. Let's get to it. After all, we're in this together.
Listen to your heart. Don't let it quit on you. High blood pressure can lead to a stroke, heart attack, or death. Get your blood pressure to a healthy range before it's too late. Find out how at heart.org/blood pressure. Check, change, control. A message from the American Heart Association, the American Stroke Association, and the Ad Council.
All right, welcome back to the program, folks. This is your host, Andy Gurvich. I'm sitting with Stephan Schwartz, and when we left before the break, we were talking about a lot of things: the nature of consciousness, the project of the founding fathers of the United States, the sort of epigenetic implications of slavery, and the power imbalance in our culture. And I want to sort of backtrack through some of that and go back a little bit to some of your history, and then move forward into some of those things we were just talking about. You told me a story once about your time in New York as a screenwriter after you helped an individual who was coming through Virginia trying to write a screenplay about sort of old world Virginia, and how that led you to one of the, what I would consider one of the real thresholds and change of consciousness in your life that I think led to a lot of the research that came after, and then eventually with your time with the Cayce family. Do you mind sharing that story with our audience?
Sure.
Great.
Well, I went to New York. I wrote a film for Colonial Williamsburg to help a guy that became friendly with whom I became friendly.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sent it up to New York to another guy I knew who I had met when I was in the service. And I was in the Army as a corpsman. And he read it and then offered me a job and said, come up to New York and we'll hire you as a screenwriter. So I went up to New York and I immediately got I was hired by a company called Screen Gems and immediately got very embroiled in writing an adaptation of a Bud Schulberg play and sort of got thrown into the film community of New York and met Andy Warhol, and who was making very strange films at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all very glamorous and exciting, and yet it's at another level. It seemed insubstantial in a way, but in any case, I went to a party that Truman Capote gave out on Fire Island, and I was going down the hall, and I looked in a mirror, and I just said to myself, looking at myself in the mirror, you are becoming an unattractive person. Your values are out of whack. And I didn't even, it was just a spontaneous ejaculation. It just came out of me.
How old were you at this time?
I was 23.
And you said like Kurt Vonnegut, Capote, you said all the New York literati were at this party.
I looked down the hall and there were all these famous people and who were on magazine covers and were being interviewed and who had written or, were well known for creativity. And a very interesting group of people. But at a certain level, I realized that that the things that I valued were not substantive. And I didn't really have anything to replace them with.
Wow.
And so I just said this to myself, looking in the mirror. I couldn't tell you why, but I just said it. And I walked out of the party and slept on the beach and walked down at the end and got the boat from Fire Island back to the mainland, and went back to New York City and packed up my car and drove back down to Virginia to the farm. I'm from Gloucester County, Virginia, which is a very rural part of Virginia on the Tidewater. It's the oldest part of Virginia. And I went home, and I didn't really know what to do with myself. I had worked for National Geographic, and I had done this screenwriting stuff and been in the Army, and
this was before the time in the Navy, right?
Huh? Oh no, the Navy came much later.
Much later, right? Okay.
No, I got drafted.
Oh,
I
wow.
was working for National Geographic. I got drafted.
Oh, wow.
During Vietnam. Anyway, I was kind of just sitting there in a kind of existential funk, because I didn't know what the next move was, and it was the first time in my life that I had really been faced with that. And one day I was sitting there, and I looked out, and this house that I grew up in had been built in 1653, and it had fairly extensive grounds, and everybody who'd ever owned it had loved it, and so it had beautiful plantings, and it had been there a long time, hundreds of years. So it was really very beautiful. And I looked out, and in the gardens was this couple walking along, and they were dressed as if they were city people, not people in the country. I mean, the man had on a gray serge double-breasted suit, and the woman was wearing this very smart white linen outfit, and they just didn't look like people who were in rural Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked over where the cars came down, and where the cars parked, and no, there was no car there. And I looked down to the water, thinking maybe they'd come in a boat, and no boat. So I thought, well, how did they get here? Who are they? And just about that time, they saw me looking at them, and they came over and knocked on the screen door. I was on the screen porch on the water side of the house, and I opened the door, and they came in, and this woman looked at me for a long time and said to me, without any preamble or introduction, "Do you believe in reincarnation?" And I'd never thought about it.
Yeah. Because
I had grown up in a family that wasn't against religion, but simply had no interest in it.
Yeah.
And so it just wasn't a subject of interest. So there wasn't anybody for it or against it. It just didn't come up.
Right.
And but I thought about it for a minute, and I said, well, yeah, I guess I do. It has a certain symmetry. And then I said to this woman, who are you? Why are you here?
Yeah.
How did you get here? And she said, well, I had a dream that told me to come up and invite you down for the weekend. I thought, oh my God, I've got some psychotic person who sort of wandered in. But we lived at the end of a 10-mile long school bus road, and the lane was a mile long, and so this was not a place that you got to casually.
Mm-hmm.
And she said to me, "Do you know who Edgar Cayce is?" And I said, "No, I don't." And she said, "Well, you really need to look at a book called There Is a River." And she explained to me that Edgar Cayce was this person who would go into a altered state of consciousness, and from that point could give all kinds of information and could describe things and give medical counseling. And the whole thing sounded completely outrageous to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to her, who are you? I still don't get this. So she introduced herself as Paula Fitzgerald, and her husband is Ed Fitzgerald. And I looked at this man, and he was very smartly dressed, and I don't know why. It came to me, I said, you aren't Ed Fitzgerald, who was the production designer on the movie Seven Samurai, are you? And that was a movie that was current at the time. And,
yeah.
And he said, yes, I am. And so that immediately shifted them from being crazies, however well-dressed, to being potentially rational people. And so it shifted my sense of sort of what was going on. And I said, well, I don't understand. I mean, what do you mean you had a dream? And so she said to me, well, I had this dream. And I said, well, how would you know where the turns were? And she said, well, I noticed things. And when I woke up, I wrote it all down, and we just drove it. And I didn't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
And just about that time, a green Ford station wagon came down the driveway, and driven by this other couple, and she said to me, give me your telephone number. This is 1965. She said, give me your telephone number. And I did. I wrote it out on a card, and she said, thank you very much, and they walked out and got in this car and drove away. And I thought, that was the strangest encounter I've ever had.
Mm-hmm.
And about a week later, I get a call from, she had said to me also, would you like to meet Thomas Jefferson? And I said, well, yeah, is he back?
Yeah.
And she said, well, as it happens, he is. And I said, well, how do you know that? And she said, well, Edgar Cayce described this person as having had a life as Thomas Jefferson. And I thought, oh, dear heaven.
Yeah. We've gone off the deep end.
Right. So anyway, about a week later, I get a telephone call, and it's a voice on the other end, a male, and he says, my name is Thomas Jefferson Davis, and I'd like to invite you down for the weekend to Virginia Beach.
Wow.
So I thought, I was in this great existential funk because I didn't know what to do with my life. I really was, it's hard to explain, but I really didn't know what to do. So I thought, well, okay, I'll go down there for the weekend. And so I said to my family, I'm going down to Virginia Beach, got in my car and drove down there. And I got down there to the address that he had given me, having no idea what I was going to get into. And it was clearly a shop that was going to be selling leather things, leather sandals and leather bags, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a guy up on a ladder putting the sign up, and I said to him, I'm looking for T.J. Davis. And he said, oh, well, he's not here, but Joan is going to help you, and you must be Stephan Schwartz. And around the corner came this really attractive young woman, these beautiful lavender eyes, and she said, well, T.J. asked me to get you to take you up to the ARE, and I said, I don't know what the ARE is, so she explained to me what the Edgar Cayce organization was, and we got in my car and we drove up Atlantic Avenue in Virginia Beach to what had been the Cayce's old hospital, and we got out and went into what was clearly a library, and along two corners of the walls of the library were these green notebooks. And she said, these are the readings, and she had explained to me what a reading was. Today I would say these are remote viewing session notes, but session data, but she explained to me that Cayce would move into this altered state of consciousness, and when he was in this state of consciousness, he could then answer questions about anything and give accurate information about it, and that these were all recorded, and there were thousands of these readings, and there they were. And so I at random just walked down the wall and pulled one of these green notebooks out. They were loose leaf, like school notebooks, and I opened it up, and it was a reading that had been given in 1936 for a woman. And I started to read it, and Andrew, I can only tell you that my hair stood on end. Because the last thing that I had done for the Geographic when I was drafted, before I had to go into the service, was research on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so I was fairly knowledgeable about what was known about the Dead Sea Scrolls, having spent a number of months interviewing most of the principal researchers and also reading everything that had been written.
Wow.
And I knew that Cayce described this as, he said, to this person, it turned out to be a woman, that she had been a woman in the Essene community at Khirbet Qumran and a teacher of astrology. And at that moment, I knew that in 1936, that nobody knew that Khirbet Qumran existed as an Essene community. It wouldn't be discovered until 11 years. I mean, they knew about that there was a site there, but it was thought to be an obscure outpost of the Emperor Vespasian's legions during the Roman period, and nobody knew it as an Essene community, and yet that's what he was saying. And it wasn't until 1947 when a young Bedouin, a young boy had been chucking rocks into a cave.
And he heard the smashing sound, right?
Yeah, and he went in, and there were these urns that were filled with what we now know as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I knew that from the discovery of the scrolls, which was 11 years after he had given his reading, that excavation had revealed that women had been a part of the community, and the scrolls themselves talk endlessly about this obsession with astrology. So I wanted to know, where did Edgar Cayce get this information 11 years before anybody discovered it? Where was the information stored? How did he get at it? And all those questions that immediately came up, because what he had said in 1936 was completely accurate based on things that were discovered 11 years later. And so I said to this young woman, let me take you to dinner. I have a few questions. And so we started talking about this, and the more
purely scientific dinner with the lavender eyes, right?
Yes. And this is the 1960s, sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Right.
And so she said, well, you can stay with me. And I said, well, first I need to make a call. And I called back to the farm and said, this is going to take a little longer than a weekend. And it actually took 4 years. And so it changed my life, because I sat down immediately and I moved into the old hospital and lived there. And I started reading the readings, and I just started at the beginning. And because this is 1965, so in those days, many of the people that had known Edgar Cayce were still alive, and it was just a very tiny little group of people. And Gladys Davis Turner, his lifelong secretary, who had kept all these records, was still alive, and I got to know her, and so she began. I got started reading at the beginning, and she would sort of help me, lead me through it, and I just started reading, and I read every day. That's what I did.
Wow.
And for about 4 years, and about after the first year, I realized that this had something to do with parapsychology, and so they had a very exhaustive library and extensive, and so I started reading all the parapsychological stuff as well. And at the end of 4 years, I had read all of the readings and virtually everything written in parapsychology. And out of that came a commitment that I had found what I wanted to do, and that was I wanted to understand the nature of consciousness. And so I started meditating and working with healing and therapeutic intention, and that really shaped my life from then onward to the present day, because those are the things that I've done research on. The readings themselves prompted me to begin designing a protocol that I originally called distant viewing. Today we call it remote viewing. And I began doing experiments with people to see if they could accurately describe persons, places, events, objects from which they were separated by either time or space, and under very rigorous controlled conditions. And so I discovered people could do it. And in fact, they could do it with extraordinary accuracy and considerable frequency.
See, this is fascinating. I want to stop you there. We're going to go to break here again in a second. And when we come back, I want to talk about the very work that you're bringing up and go into your work with remote viewing, the Mobius Institute, what happened in Egypt, the Deep Quest experiments, and your work with the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness. So we got a lot to cover still, but are you okay taking a break here
Sure.
again? Excellent.
Yep.
Just before we go to break, I want to say two things. When I was visiting you last, you were very gracious, you and your wife, and you gave Celeste and I a begonia plant that actually was in the Cayce library, or at least a clone from one.
In Cayce's office.
In his office, yes. And it's sitting here right above.
It was given to Edgar Cayce the day his hospital opened.
Oh, no kidding.
And it's in all the pictures, and Gladys gave me a cutting from it. We call the plants Cayce. Mm-hmm. And it's a very hardy plant. We actually have cloned a number of others off, or taking clippings and starting them. And we gave you, I think, Cayce 5.
Cayce 5, nice.
and so you have a 100-year-old plant that was one of Edgar Cayce's favorites, and that is pictured in the early pictures of his office.
Well, that very plant is still thriving. It's sitting right above us in my den here as we're recording this. And if what we know about the science of non-locality is true, which is once two objects have come in contact with one another, they remain inexorably linked throughout space and time, that means that Cayce is also here in the room with us, which I find fascinating. He is the most studied clairvoyant really in the modern era. Is that correct? I mean, just before we go to break here,
yes.
just for our audience that is not familiar, because I know a lot of people that are going to listen to this show, and just briefly before we go to break, that hear us talking about this kind of thing are immediately going to do what you did at the time, which is dismiss this all as a bunch of snake oil salesman hackery, right? And if you could just speak to that briefly about Cayce's actual life and how much he was studied.
Well, I mean, Edgar Cayce is unquestionably the most thoroughly documented person with remote viewing skills, or actually I would call them non-local perception skills now. Because of Gladys Davis, meticulous records were kept, and so there are documented examples of Cayce speaking languages he didn't speak, and describing in great detail therapeutic recommendations down to describing where people could obtain the drugs that he was, or the treatments that he was suggesting they use. I mean, there's a famous case of called the smoke oil case, in which he described a particular kind of therapeutic oil, and when they went to get it, nobody had ever heard of it, so they came back for a second reading, and he told them that, well, it's in a particular drugstore in another city, and it was up on a shelf, and so they contacted the pharmacy, and the pharmacy said, no, we never heard of it. And so they got a third reading, and this time he described exactly where the bottle was in the pharmacy, in the storeroom, and then they got a telegram from the pharmacist saying, boy, I went back into the storeroom, and there, exactly where this guy said, is this bottle, and this company's gone out of business. We haven't used this in years, but for some reason there's this one little bottle that was back behind a bunch of other bottles, and I didn't even know it was there, but we've got it now, and we're going to send it to you. And they did send it to the person, and the doctor did use it, and it did cure the condition. So there are about 15,000 Cayce readings, many of them, a majority of them really, having to do with medical issues. And I think it could be said very, very correctly that Edgar Cayce really is the father of holistic medicine.
Wow.
Because his diet, for instance, which is a kind of modified Mediterranean diet, we now know is in fact the healthiest diet. His comments about exercise, we now know to be correct.
Meditation.
His treatments in a variety of areas are now standard parts of holistic medicine.
That's
So
really...
it's an extraordinary example, but he's not alone. There are, of course, historically, people like Nostradamus, but there are also in Poland, there was a man named Stephan Schwartz, who was very similar to Cayce and did some extraordinary things, not as well documented, or not as exhaustively documented, I guess that's the way to put it. What we now know, and what the Cayce reading said, was that anybody could do this. Some people would be better at it than others, and some people are more gifted. There's basically two components to it. There is your innate ability, just like your innate ability to play tennis or chess or do mathematics or play the violin. And then there is the discipline that you develop in order to express that potentiality. And we now know that, for instance, in remote perception experiments, that meditators do better than non-meditators, because the key to all of this, exactly as the Cayce reading said, is the ability to hold intention-focused awareness. And that's what shamanism is about. It's about teaching people how, in a culturally appropriate way, to sustain intention-focused awareness so that they can open to this part of themselves, which everybody has, but most people aren't aware of because it's simply overwhelmed by the sense impressions and cognitive thought that goes on most of the time. But this, what is religiously called the still small voice, which is this non-local aspect of consciousness, is clearly there. There are now 6 protocols that are routinely used in laboratories around the world, each of which has independently, each of these 6 protocols has independently produced odds of better than 1 in a billion that it could be happening by chance. That's a 6 sigma. It's 1 in a billion is at that level. You're at 0.999999967, I think it is, percentile that this is correct. So we are now, I think, facing what are the implications, and how would you structure society if you believed that consciousness was fundamental and that it continued beyond your individual corporeal life, and that we were linked in a matrix of life in which all life was interconnected and interdependent. And that has become really my consuming interest, is what does that look like?
This is fascinating.
What flows out of that, and how can you produce it?
That's fascinating, and that's exactly where the conversation is going. So when we come back from break, I want to ask you about that very thing, and then we'll get into a discussion about the new book as well. Does that sound good?
Sure.
All right, folks, you're listening to On the Block Radio. This is your host, Andy Gurvich. Our guest is Stephan Schwartz, and we'll be back right after this.
Join us for the second hour of OTB Radio with our guest, Stephan Schwartz. You won't want to miss it.